The world learned to applaud the end of wars with dates, signatures, and official photographs. But the true history, the one written with blood, mud, and silence, rarely obeys the victor's calendar. When the sirens announced the end of the Second World War, when flags were raised and exhausted cities breathed relief, there were men who did not celebrate, not out of bitterness or defeat, but out of honor. Men who understood with brutal clarity that the proclaimed peace did not mean conquered freedom. They chose to remain standing when the world knelt before a new order. And in that choice, a heroism was born that sought no medals, only dignity. The war for them did not end. It changed form, changed scenery and name, but never changed purpose. The pride that moved them came not from speeches or external promises, but from the deep conviction that a nation lives as long as there are those who refuse to forget it. This is the non-negotiable principle that sustained a forgotten resistance, a struggle waged in the shadows while the world turned the page believing everything had ended, without realizing that for some, the war had only just begun under another mask. In the dense, ancient forests of the Baltic, where the wind crosses through pine trees as if whispering centuries of memories, there arose a resistance that defied the destiny imposed by great powers. In Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the collapse of Nazi Germany brought not independence, but the replacement of one occupier with another. The Red Army advanced as official liberator, but was received as an annexing force by populations who already knew the weight of Soviet repression. Mass deportations, summary trials, nocturnal disappearances, and the violent dissolution of national identities became routine. It was in that instant, not of euphoria, but of lucidity, that thousands decided to vanish from the map and reappear in history. They would be called the Forest Brothers, a simple name for an extraordinary choice, to live as shadows so that their nations would not die in the light of a lie. While the rest of Europe celebrated Reconstruction and signed peace pacts, these men entered a voluntary exile into the green depths of their lands, knowing that the price of visibility would be certain death or definitive enslavement. The forest was not merely refuge, it was the last bastion of a sovereignty that refused to die, the last territory where an invisible flag still fluttered in the cold Baltic wind. These men were not legends born ready-made. They were farmers who knew the land inch by inch, students who carried books in their memory, war veterans who had already survived one hell and refused to accept another. They entered the forests with scarce weapons, but with a spiritual heritage that no empire could confiscate. They built underground bunkers where life was a constant exercise in resistance, where each dawn was a victory and each night an absolute risk. They fed themselves on what the land allowed and on the silent solidarity of civilians who, even under threat of death, chose to help. There, in the green heart of the Baltic, war assumed a different rhythm. Fewer explosions, more waiting. Fewer battlefronts, more ambushes. Less visible glory, more invisible courage. They were ordinary men transformed into warriors by necessity, not by ambition. And this transformation made them something rarer than professional soldiers. It made them pure defenders of a cause that existed only in collective memory and future hope. Each bunker carved into the frozen earth was an act of faith. Each meal divided in secret was a sacrament of loyalty. Each name whispered in darkness was a prayer for the survival of something greater than themselves. The daily sacrifice was not in great battles, but in the silent renunciation of everything that defines a normal life: family, comfort, predictable future, peaceful aging alongside one's loved ones. The machine that turned against them was cold, methodical, and relentless. The NKVD, the arm of Soviet repression, transformed the forests into hunting grounds. Informants were planted like poisoned seeds. Entire families were punished on suspicion of collaboration, and the promise of amnesty was used as a trap. Still, the Forest brothers resisted. They resisted because they believed, and this belief kept them alive, that the world would not forever permit the expansion of a regime built upon fear. Many expected a new global war, an inevitable confrontation between the West and the Soviet Union that would bring final liberation. This hope, though never realized, was fuel enough for years of struggle. Each successful ambush, each destabilized Soviet column, each miraculous escape reinforced the sensation that, even isolated, they were part of something greater than their own survival. Soviet repression was not satisfied with the military defeat of the resistors. It sought the total destruction of their memory, the posthumous humiliation of their names, the transformation of heroes into terrorists in the eyes of official history. Specialized troops entered the forests with trained dogs, modern equipment, and an ideological coldness that transformed each operation into a ritual of extermination. For each resistor captured, dozens of civilians were interrogated, tortured, deported to the far reaches of Siberia, where eternal cold replaced the temperate forests as the final setting of shattered existences. And still, the resistance persisted, fed not by the illusion of military victory, but by the spiritual necessity of not allowing the lie to become the only available narrative. The years advanced, and with them the weight of time. The world moved forward, rebuilding cities, signing treaties, inaugurating a new international order. In the forests, however, the clock seemed broken. War persisted in whispers, isolated shots, and endless pursuits. Historians like Mart Lahr would later record that thousands died in this historical limbo, combatants who did not fall in officially recognized battles, but in confrontations that the dominant history preferred to call banditry to erase their political significance. This official narrative tried to reduce heroes to criminals, resistance to common crime, sacrifice to stubbornness. However, for those who lived and died there was no confusion. To fight was the only way to remain human in a system that demanded total submission. The 1950s arrived, bringing with them the consolidation of Soviet dominance, the normalization of oppression, the international acceptance of borders redrawn by force. The West, occupied with its own reconstruction and divided by the Cold War, abandoned any real pretension of liberating the Baltics. Vague promises of support transformed into diplomatic silence, and the Forest brothers understood that no cavalry was coming to their rescue. Still, they continued, because the struggle was no longer about strategic victory, but about ontological dignity, about the right to exist as subject of one's own history and not as object of another's will. Each passing year made resistance more difficult, more solitary, more desperate, but also more pure in its essence, stripped of any illusion and reduced to the irreducible core of a fundamental moral choice. The heroism of the Forest brothers lay not in the illusion of certain victory, but in the moral clarity of their choice. They knew the price would be high and that the reward might never come in their lifetime. Even so, they remained. Some resisted until the beginning of the 1950s. Others, incredibly, survived into the 1960s, living decades as armed ghosts of a past that refused to die. Each of them carried the awareness that they might never see their homeland free, but also the certainty that without their resistance, that homeland would not even exist as dignified memory. Death, when it came, was rarely grandiose. It was solitary, silent, often betrayed, and yet it was a death that echoed louder than many victory speeches. There was something transcendent in this obstinate refusal to capitulate. something that surpassed military or political logic and touched a deeper dimension of human experience, the non-negotiable need to live and die according to one's own terms, even if those terms condemned one to suffering and obscurity. The last Forest Brothers were no longer warriors in the conventional sense. They were living witnesses to a truth the world preferred to forget, walking symbols of a resistance that would not submit to cowardly pragmatism disguised as political realism. When they finally fell, many of them old and exhausted, having survived 2 decades hidden like hunted animals, they took with them not only their own lives, but the last tangible vestige of a war that official history had declared ended before it had truly begun. When the last shot was fired and the last combatant fell, there was no official announcement. No treaty was signed to end that parallel war. The world did not stop to recognize that long after the official end of history's most devastating conflict, men continued to die for a simple and eternal idea: the right to decide one's own destiny. Today, looking back, it is impossible not to feel pride before this obstinate refusal to accept the lie as peace. History may have been slow to recognize these soldiers, but the truth persists like the very forests that hid them. War, after all, does not end when the victors say it is over. It ends when freedom ceases to be a promise and becomes reality. And as long as that does not happen, there will always be those who, with silent courage, will choose to fight after the world believes everything is already resolved. The lesson of the Forest Brothers crosses generations not as tactical or strategic teaching, but as unwavering moral testimony that there are things worth dying for, precisely because they are the only things worth living for. Their lives were not wasted on a lost cause. They were invested in a truth that transcends temporal victories and defeats. When finally the Soviet Union collapsed and the Baltic countries regained their independence, the memory of these men emerged from the shadows like a fulfilled prophecy, proving that no empire can definitively suffocate the human yearning for freedom, and that resistance, even when it seems futile, always sows the seeds of a future liberation. They fought in a war the world did not recognize, died for a victory they would not live to see, but their choice inscribed in history and immortal truth. As long as there is a single man willing to say no to tyranny, tyranny will never be absolute, and freedom, however distant it may seem, remains possible.